Any questions they wish to raise now before we get into the panel discussion, and I may, as I'm on the mic, I may defer it to the panel anyway, but please do feel free to ask. Excellent. So let's move ahead with the second part, the main part of this workshop. It's really a panel discussion and question time. I mentioned earlier it will be moderated by Dr. Leon Benham from BirdLife International. Then we have 4 other experts joining us today. I won't introduce them formally now. I'll let them come up and take their place on the stage, in the comfy seats that we've laid on, and look forward to a lively discussion. Welcome very much your input through this discussion. Probe them with hard questions and some easy ones as well. And let's move on to that stage then. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Martin, for that interesting presentation and useful introduction. So we have a glittering panel here this afternoon. I'll get them to introduce themselves in a moment. My name is Leon Benham from BirdLife International. I'm Director of Science Policy and Information. We're one of the 4 partners in the IBAT Alliance, as Martin's mentioned. And my panelists are?
I'm Conrad Savvy from... I'm Conrad Savvy from Conservation International, learning how to use a mic for the first time.
Laurie Conso from International Finance Corporation, IFC of the World Bank.
John Ekstrom, Director of the Biodiversity Consultancy in Cambridge.
I'm Anne-Marie Fleury with the International Council on Mining and Metals.
That's great, thanks. So I'm going to pose them a question to get things started while you're thinking of your questions. Although we're here in the comfortable chairs, don't make them too comfortable. Ask them some hard questions if you like. Before we get going, though, it'd be good to know from the audience, how many of you have actually heard of IBAT before? Most of you, that's great. And how many people here are from the business, corporate sector? Great, so it's a good mix, I think. So maybe just ask each of you in turn to give me a very quick rundown on what you understand by biodiversity risk and what you or your organisation is doing about it. Why don't we start with Conrad?
They're putting the NGO on the spot first. I guess from an NGO point of view, biodiversity risk in terms of a corporate risk of biodiversity would really, is one of the issues undermining achievement of our mission as an NGO. Obviously CI and many other NGOs like TNC, World Wildlife Fund, are trying to achieve conservation of biodiversity in the environment. And so anything that is detracting from that is obviously something to be addressed. And so we basically view biodiversity risk in the corporate context as a problem to manage and alleviate by helping companies address those risks as early as possible and as best as possible. Our mission is actually still carried forward successfully.
I think for IFC, clearly we lend to these companies and we buy equity into these companies. The most obvious risk is we have a compliance risk because we have our 8 performance standards. One of them is biodiversity. So we'd like to ensure that we understand what are the risks going into a certain deal in addition to our clients. Of course, we also have the other types of risks that businesses face are also our own risks. So when it comes to their regulatory risk and reputational risk, but I'll let Anne-Marie speak about that piece of it.
Thanks, Leon. I think business risk around biodiversity have become more and more important over the past few years. We've all heard the traditional business case for biodiversity management that includes access to land, seat at the policy table, etc. I think we're now in an era where there's a new business case for biodiversity management. This includes the financial requirements of the multilateral banks, new government regulations, so there's lots more government policies around biodiversity offsets, and also many companies have put in place no net loss commitments. So these are all risks that the transnational companies are needing to manage.
Thank you. I would add to that the precedent, the envelope that's being pushed, I guess, and the influence from the top. As more companies make commitments, I think there's more pressure between companies to push that up. So the question to us was, how do we see risk and what are we doing about it? I won't go into the business case much. I think most people here will be much more aware of that than me. But what's ICMM doing about it? I think most people may be aware of ICMM, but maybe not. It's an industry association looking at sustainable development issues that includes certain commitments. And on the biodiversity side, there's a framework that includes a commitment to report annually, as well as third-party assurance of that. So those are the key commitments across the sustainability framework that include biodiversity elements as well. And then I guess in addition to that, there's also a separate commitment which was made in 2003 around protected areas, which included a no-go commitment to World Heritage sites and various other elements. But that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thanks, Marilys. Let's open the floor to some questions now. Gather a few together, then see what people have to say in response. Who'd like to pose a question? Martin is poised there with the microphone to hand to you. Must be some questions.
Eva Zadeh with the World Business Council. I was wondering if a company is going to use IBAT to explore a site, wouldn't a well-done environmental impact assessment already highlight that it's an important area?
Excellent question. Why don't we start with that, and while you're thinking of some more, who'd like to field that?
A well-done environmental impact assessment should provide that information. I'd say so far we often are given EIAs and asked to review them for biodiversity issues, and I'd say we've never seen a single one that has identified all these biodiversity issues. They're often, if there is information in them, it's hidden, it's deep down inside, and the significance of the information isn't understood. I think this is where IBAT provides a particular benefit, because biodiversity risks, I think there's two issues to them. One is that they're quite difficult to predict. It's quite difficult to know what the issues are going to be, whether particular species or habitats are going to be an issue for a project, because it's the relationship between the physical impacts and the ecological receptors. But biodiversity data itself is relatively opaque. It's quite difficult to get hold of. Just very few individuals and organizations in the world hold that information. So IBAT does provide the best current tool for both species and sites around the world to look at those risks.
Let me follow up to you, John, there. The other thing about IBAT is it should be used well before the ESIA process, so way upstream of that. By the time the ESIA is commissioned, by that time the site is more or less selected. There is some refinement of that site, but it's often too late to make real changes. So we use it in IFC to screen for projects, actually before we get to an actual appraisal of the project, but way in the early review. And that's why it's so helpful, because often in those early review phases, the companies don't really have even the biodiversity expertise that is looking in detail to these things, and IFC is having to do reviews very quickly. So when we want to know right away, show me a landscape and show me all the existing prioritizations on it, and that's exactly what IBAT does.
Just very
there we go.
Just really directly following on that, on the mining sector, typically you'd be looking before your project design, and the thing about IBAT is that it's a one-stop shop as well, and also it's in a format that works for exploration companies and experts, because it's all in GIS, so you can overlay that directly with the information, the expertise that the people on the ground have and the tools they use.
And just I'd add from an NGO, so one minor, just a difference of opinion with Anne-Marie is, I think IBAT's more of a first-stop shop. I wouldn't say it's a one-stop. I mean, there's many more other stops after that training station. I think in terms of an EIA, again, having the pleasure of reviewing many EIAs without partners, we do projects with them as an NGO, there are often issues. Well, there's two things, key things that we find. One is that NGOs are already consulted very late in the process. So by the time EIA is underway or done, there's been money spent and things done that we can't change. And the second thing is that in terms of scoping the EIA in the first place, who's the expert you hire? We've seen examples where we're given an EIA and there's a great assessment of a particular species, a great management plan is in place, the world experts being consulted. You spend 5 minutes in the GIS program and find 6 other species that have been totally ignored. And so I think the value of IBAT in supporting a good EIA when those happen is in scoping out the frames in terms of reference for a good EIA, I think. So who should you hire? What should they focus on? Perhaps what place they should focus on also.
Thanks, Matt. Another question?
Hi, Warwick Masters from De Beers, South Africa. We do an annual biodiversity overlap assessment, and in the past used IBAT, but found that because of the data, it was a bit outdated. So you mentioned in the presentation it does get updated, but the big value is in your national level in terms of high priority areas. And I think that a big gap for IBAT is to link in with national species and NBSAPs. Then you can apply a hell of a lot more information and data that you can gather.
So that's an interesting point, and maybe the panel would like to follow up on that and get their perspectives on, where do you think IBAT currently falls short? What more could it be doing to be more useful to business? But we'll come back in a second. Are there other questions you'd like to take first?
Thanks, Warren Funston from Eskom, South Africa. Just following on from Warwick's question, is there an interface or a vehicle in IBAT that businesses could use to feed back on ground truthing information?
Why don't we tackle those 2 points now? We'd like to pick up on the issue of what can we do to improve IBAT and make it more useful? What kind of feedback might we incorporate in it?
I'd like a stab at this as being one of the partners behind IBAT that is generating and supporting that data development. And then we have to hear from you guys after about your interpretations of this. But I think one of the issues you highlighted is very true. The core set of data that IBAT uses is linked to IUCN standards, the red list, the emerging work around key biodiversity areas and protected areas. Now, those things around the world vary in how much they're aligned with national processes. So in some places they're very well aligned. Madagascar, the government is using KBAs as part of how they define conservation areas. Whereas in South Africa, for example, there are IBAs in South Africa, but the MBSAP process is not fully aligned with how IBAs are picked up. I think the issue there is really one in terms of greater alignment between standard-setting bodies like the IUCN and having governments draw on those standards. So, for example, there's a big process now, which may have been, you may be aware of, but between the IUCN Task Force for Species, there's a task force on the Species Value Commission and then the World Protected Areas Commission to try and look at how to define important sites. That is trying to draw upon many ways of defining important sites, like important bird areas. In South Africa, there were a system called the CBA, so I think critical biodiversity areas they were called. And so trying to look at all these various ways of defining important things at a national level, and how do we draw out some common patterns that are applied globally. Having said that, even as that alignment happens, there will always be national level things that are different because of local values. And so I think, again, that first stop shop, IBAT really is showing you, hoping over time will get better, a very first cut what the global conservation community has consensus around, but then hopefully opening up the discussion about what other things happen at a local level. In terms of data quality, yes, that's a big issue for us, and this is again why IBAT even exists, is data maintenance. Okay, a good example is the WPA, the Protected Areas Database, that Melissa can probably talk about more later on, but there's been a cycle of, throw money at the project, data improves in quality really well, that gets a lot of attention, then people forget about it when it starts eroding in quality. And so one of the issues why IBAT exists is trying to flatten out that curve of maintenance costs to try and maintain high quality and to, again, keep updating as it goes forward. So again, IBAT's been around for now 4 years. We've made some small grants to support data development, but it's still early days. So hopefully, again, watch this space, will get better. The question on feedback, good question. Again, IBAT draws on existing data development processes, so the IUCN Red List, people like BirdLife doing the IBAs, Melissa's team in Cambridge, collating particular information. Those are existing processes, and so our recommendation is to actually have businesses feed their data into those existing processes. And there are some guidance on the website and a note that describes who to talk to. So for red list species, there is a species commission you can talk to. For IBAs or other information, again, BirdLife has national offices around the world. So that's probably the best way. I mean, IBAT is really just an interface to share data, but to get data back in, probably going through these existing partnerships and processes.
So Conrad, in your comment on the national data issue, if I understood you, you're saying that IBAT is a first stop shop. We need to get onto 2 buses or more at that one stop, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, could be a bit challenging, but I guess it's feasible. Who else would like to comment on those questions?
Good questions. I think they partly relate to this never-ending discussion of global versus national versus local stakeholder biodiversity values, which is really a big issue for a lot of different industries. IBAT does provide the essentially global biodiversity risk assessment, but often, certainly for some of our clients, they do find that the national or local biodiversity values are as or even more important than the global ones. As examples, where say tapir is globally threatened, it's very common at some sites and local stakeholders are concerned about it. The level of granularity required to put that kind of local biodiversity, certainly MBSAPs I agree, IBAT could be improved with some of the national species lists, etc. But the level of granularity required to put in some of those local biodiversity values, I think, is going to be beyond IBAT as a tool. I think when we get to that kind of site level assessment, it does need people on the ground to actually speak with the institutions who are working there, and of course even do field surveys to find that kind of information.
I'll probably make one point just to improve that alignment between national and global values. I mean, this process, this task force that exists to try and develop these criteria for globally important sites is looking for information and feedback from constituents, both data providers and data users. And so I very much urge people who find those examples to really contribute to that process and share, like the tapir and issues like that. How do we actually align those global standards as much as possible with national values, but recognizing that it'll never actually be fully achieved because of the nature of those values.
So one thing that we have been talking about in BirdLife recently is trying to get our local conservation groups, we have people working at local level at IBAs around the world, to feed updates, information on what's going on at their sites, social issues, conservation issues, into IBAT in an informal way. So there might be some kind of a blog section underneath the site information. Do you think, as panelists, that's something which we should be exploring? Is it useful? Will it respond to this kind of need? Or is it just an irrelevance?
I'm not sure if that's going to respond to it. I think the need for business, and perhaps on this reading, was they're looking for more of a platform that they could upload information onto and perhaps maybe even manipulate data, and I don't think that that's what IBAT's going to do. As far as feedback and more information on sites, yes. I mean, that's, sure, of course. The more information you can have on local conditions, the better. I don't know if that's going to directly respond to these single requests.
So different issues, perhaps.
I might throw a question to someone in the audience if I can.
Yeah, go for it.
The World Database on Protected Areas has a wiki feature that allows that kind of input. How well has that worked so far? I think it's only 2 or 3 years that that's been in place. the listening minds being asked the question. So yeah, the World Database on Protected Areas is accessed through Protected Planet, which is linked to through IBAT. So when you, Martin was showing, when you link to any of the protected area boundaries through IBAT, and then you go through directly to Protected Planet to see more detailed information. Protected Planet has a community edit version on it, which allows people who have on-ground knowledge of particular protected areas, where they see maybe that boundaries are inaccurate or missing, or there's gaps in the data, to be able to suggest edits or suggest new data, and also increase the metadata that we have as well. So looking at the designations, IUCN categories, the sort of stuff that we may be lacking in the database. That comes through an edit version into Protected Planet, which we can then take those suggestions and take them back to national governments to verify. So there is a feedback process built in. It is a slow process because everything that's in the WDPA has to be verified by national governments, and they are the official data sources. So we can't take edits that are coming from users or from protected area managers on ground and put them directly into the data set, but we can filter them back to the governments and have them verified. So it does work. It's a very slow process. It's a time-consuming process, but there is an option for people to put in edits and suggestions and changes.
And so have you made changes since you have?